A bridge so quiet the world itself seems to hold its breath. And beneath it, something older than language waits, speaking in a voice that will not be ignored. If you are watching this now, tell me where you're watching from in the comments and the exact time. This is not idle curiosity. It is initiation. In 1898, in the lonely ribs of Missouri's Ozarks, Sutton's crossing was a simple wooden trestle, ordinary to any mapmaker, obscene to anyone who paid attention. The official ledger reduced it to bridge number 27. The people called it the Gateway. Historians call patterns. I hand you meanings. The ridgelines, limestone hollows, a river that carves its throat through the earth. These are not scenery. They are the grammar of a place that learns how to speak to those who listen. Listen to what the records cannot hide. From 1888 to 1901, the county collected 17 incidents tied to Sutton's planks. Disappearances, agitation, voices reported, men returning altered. Thomas Holloway's horse refused to cross, and then he sold his land and vanished from any useful life. Ezekiel Morrison rerouted his trade route after he described a conversation inside his skull while standing on the bridge. Abigail Waywright, a midwife, was found wandering near the eastern approach at 4 in the morning, asking whether the voices in the wood had sent for her. These are not colourful folk tales, they are repeated calibrations of an effect. The bridge's peculiarity began with the river itself. Surveyors in the 1870s noted a strangled acoustic where water passing over submerged limestone made a reverberation that resembled distant speech. That alone might explain nerves and superstition, but Sutton's crossing did something more precise. It tuned attention. People did not simply hear strange noise, their attention was corroded and redirected, like machinery reset to a new purpose. And men who crossed found their priorities altered. They came back not quieter but reorganized around something else. Jacob Mercer was the kind of man the world trusts with other people's safety, a foreman at the Palmer lead mine, 15 years of records calling him dependable and steady. So when Jacob changed, the ledger of normal life rewrote itself. One December evening he crossed the bridge and returned with more snow on his clothes than the weather warranted. He told his wife the river had been using words. He stopped eating, he stopped speaking. He stood for hours at windows, eyes fixed toward the bridge, as if listening to a remote conversation no one else could hear. Attunement is the clinical name for what unfolded. Sutton's crossing offered a calibration to the mind, a frequency spun from water, stone and old wood that altered perception. Dr. Samuel Parkman, the nearest physician, recorded no organic cause and found himself unnerved when Jacob animated briefly at the mention of the bridge. In private letters, the doctor speculated about environmental causes, mineral emanations affecting nerves, but his notes end on a colder worry. Some returns could not be reduced to chemistry. Men came back reorganized in ways no neurology could easily map. What does a mind do when it is taught to listen? What happens when listening becomes obedience? Jacob began replicating strange geometric patterns in the barn, triangular configurations that produced a disorienting visual effect. He would place his hand on the center of a drawing and close his eyes as though feeling for vibrations. He walked to the bridge at night and stood motionless in the center for 40 minutes, nodding as if in agreement with an unseen interlocutor. That is not delirium, it is negotiation, a slow commerce between a man and an influence. Negotiation changes a man's axis. This is the anatomy of a different kind of corruption, not the theft of money, but the seizure of attention. Appetite is erased, priorities compress, the self hollowed to receive commands. Sutton's crossing did not shout. It taught a new grammar of listening, and to listen long enough is to be trained. Once trained, a man perceives the world by those rules. He is not simply scared, he is remade. If you stay with me through this descent, I will show you the mine ledgers, sheriff's sparse notes, Elizabeth Mercer's trembling journal entries, and the physician's late-night letters that nudge a rational mind toward a terrible possibility. This is the hinge. Once you hear the sound, the bridge taught Jacob Mercer to hear, you cannot unhear it. The question is not whether the bridge was real. The question is whether you will learn to listen when it calls. The winter of 1900 carved silence into the Ozarks. Snow lay heavy across the ridges, muting every sound except the river's ceaseless rush through the gorge beneath Sutton's crossing. Jacob Mercer's home stood 1 mile from that bridge, a modest structure warmed by firelight, yet its windows opened toward a horizon that contained only menace. From that horizon, the bridge was visible, a black silhouette against the pale winter sky, a straight line suspended over a wound in the earth. Elizabeth Mercer would later write that, from the porch, the sight filled her with a quiet dread she never admitted aloud until much later. The sense that the structure was not built over the gorge, but was instead holding open a mouth that should have remained closed. It was after December 11th when Jacob began his transformation. His brother Isaiah recorded the earliest signs with the precision of a craftsman: shorter sentences, a growing silence, an odd delay before speaking, as though Jacob's attention was always elsewhere. By December 14th, the entries darkened. Jacob awake at 3 a.m, staring toward Sutton's crossing, whispering that it was clearer at night. What was clearer? He did not elaborate. By the 17th, Isaiah discovered tracks in the snow leading from the back door toward the bridge, tracks that did not return, though Jacob was found in his bed. Elizabeth began to sleep lightly, afraid her husband would leave the house and not return. Neighbors whispered about the Mercer household, though they never voiced their thoughts directly. Rural communities notice when a man known for steadiness becomes strange. Children avoided the path near the Mercer orchard. Men at the mine spoke in hushed tones about Jacob's sudden absence from work. They did not name the bridge aloud, but the silence in their voices betrayed it. Sutton's crossing had claimed many, but to take Jacob Mercer, the man others depended upon, felt like an escalation. The physician, Dr. Parkman, puzzled over Jacob's condition. His notes are clinical, restrained, but between the lines a fear seeps through. Patient exhibits no fever, no physical symptoms, yet remains unresponsive to verbal stimuli. Parkman noticed the one moment Jacob spoke when he mentioned the bridge. It waits there still. For a doctor sworn to diagnose and explain, the phrase was a crack in reason. In a letter to a colleague, Parkman confessed his worry. These symptoms matched 3 other patients from the region: Holloway, Morrison, Wainwright, all tied to Sutton's crossing. He wrote, "I begin to wonder whether some environmental factor specific to that location might be responsible, perhaps mineral emanations, or something not yet named." Parkman would never resolve that question. Meanwhile, Jacob's drawings intensified. Pages filled with geometric forms, repeating triangles interlocked in spirals, designs that seemed to spin the eyes of anyone who looked too long. Isaiah, unsettled, described them as schemes more suited to an engineer of cathedrals than a miner. But Jacob was not building. He was decoding. Each line, each shape, seemed to calm him, as though they were not creations of his mind, but instructions received. Elizabeth, terrified yet loyal, tried to draw him back with food, with scripture, with the rituals of their marriage. None reached him. She wrote in her journal, "When I speak, it pains him. When he listens to the silence beyond the window, he seems relieved. My voice is unwelcome. The silence of that place is his comfort." Her entries are raw, the grief of watching a man dissolve while still standing before her. She wondered if her husband was still within him, or if he had already crossed into something else. By the last days of December, Isaiah noted Jacob's nightly journeys to the bridge grew longer. He stood there for near an hour, unmoving, nodding as though absorbing commands. Isaiah dared to follow once, remaining hidden in the trees. And what he described chills even now. Jacob's body stiff, his head tilting slightly as if acknowledging an unseen speaker, the river roaring beneath yet sounding. In Isaiah's words, like layered voices speaking just beyond hearing. When Jacob returned home, he was calm, almost peaceful, but Isaiah, hardened by grief and labor, wrote that he had never been so afraid in his life. The Mercer household was unraveling, and with it the veil of silence that had hidden Sutton's Crossing's true nature for decades. What had been dismissed as rural superstition was now exacting its toll on one of the community's most trusted men. The bridge was not merely a place where people vanished. It was a teacher, a corrupter, a transmitter, and Jacob Mercer had become its most faithful pupil. January of 1901 opened like a door that would not close. The Mercer household had shifted from uneasy quiet to something closer to captivity, as though the entire family lived inside Jacob's unraveling. Elizabeth documented her dread with a clarity almost too sharp to read today. Jay has not spoken for 3 days. He eats only when food is placed directly in his hand. His eyes are never with me, never with Isaiah, but always fixed east, as though the walls themselves are transparent. This was not a woman prone to dramatics. Her handwriting was practical, small and steady, but the words betray a heart cracking under the weight of something that no one in that time, or ours, could comfortably name. Isaiah's journals tell us what Elizabeth could not admit. Jacob was not simply deteriorating, he was evolving. On December 29th, Isaiah followed his brother to the bridge once more. This time he stayed closer, hidden among the pines only yards from the wooden trestle. The night was so cold the snow sang under his boots, yet Jacob walked barefoot, leaving pale impressions on the ice-crusted ground. He reached the center of the bridge and stood, arms at his sides, face tilted upward. The river thundered below. Isaiah waited. Then, without moving his lips, Jacob seemed to respond. His head nodded slowly, deliberately, in rhythm with pauses of the water's roar. Isaiah swore he heard other sounds mixed with the current, syllables without clarity, but carrying cadence like speech. The image of his brother answering silence nearly broke him. He fled before Jacob turned to return home. Patterns multiplied. By the first days of January, drawings littered the Mercer household. They appeared on scraps of wood, on the inside of the barn doors, even etched faintly into the frost that formed on window panes. Always triangles, spirals, intersecting lines that bent vision. Elizabeth described them as marks that hum in the eyes. One morning she scrubbed them from the porch planks only to find Jacob had carved them into the barn beams by nightfall. The shapes were no longer sketches, they were compulsions. Meanwhile, the town whispered. The minister of Irondale's Methodist Church came by on January 6th, after Jacob missed 2 Sundays. He left quickly, pale and unwilling to speak of what he had seen. The neighbors noted Elizabeth stopped selling preserves at the general store. Children crossing the valley for errands claimed to see Jacob standing outside at all hours, his face turned toward Sutton's crossing, his breath fogging in the air like smoke from an offering. The Mercers were dissolving into myth before they had even vanished. Dr. Parkman returned on January the 10th, this time with another physician from Farmington. Their combined notes described Jacob as physically robust, yet neurologically inaccessible. He resisted touch, reacted to voices with irritation, yet smiled faintly when the roar of the river carried across the frozen valley. In one chilling note, the second doctor recorded, "Subject's pulse quickened when bridge was mentioned. He turned his head sharply as though listening to a call." They left the household disturbed, uncertain, and more than willing to let matters rest unexamined. What Jacob experienced cannot be dismissed as hallucination alone. Witnesses confirm his nightly walks. They confirm his silence, his starvation, his obsession with geometry. They confirm the strange acoustics of the river, noted even in geological surveys decades prior. The convergence of testimony, record, and artifact forms a pattern of its own, a lattice of truth disguised as coincidence. But there is no coincidence here. Sutton's crossing was constructing something in Jacob's mind, layer by layer. A man who had once led other men underground into lead veins was now being led deeper still, into caverns of meaning invisible to the uninitiated. Elizabeth's last journal entry before the final collapse reads like a confession. Dated January 14th, it says only, "I heard it tonight, not in words, but in rhythm. The same cadence I have watched Jay answer with his nods. I fear if I listen longer, I too will understand." That single line seals the story with dread. Elizabeth, steadfast and rational, finally admitted the river was not mere water. Something beneath it, or within it, was instructing, and the bridge was its altar. By mid-January, Jacob no longer belonged to his household, his church, or his mine. He belonged to the crossing, and when a man belongs to the bridge, there is no return that resembles life as it once was. On the morning of January the 16th, the snow broke into freezing rain that sheathed the Ozark ridges in glass. Isaiah rose early, determined to keep Jacob indoors, but the effort proved futile. His brother slipped from the house without sound, barefoot again, though the ground was slick with ice. Isaiah followed at a distance, his own boots sliding dangerously on the frozen trail. He recorded later that Jacob moved without falter, as though the earth bent itself to his steps. This image, one man struggling for balance while another walked untouched, captures the widening gulf between them. Jacob was no longer subject to the same world as those who loved him. He had crossed into a rhythm Isaiah could not share. When Jacob reached the center of Sutton's crossing, he stood longer than ever before. Nearly an hour passed. Isaiah, concealed in the skeletal timber of a sycamore, noted that the rain itself seemed to fall differently over the bridge. It struck the wooden planks in uneven tempo, like a pattern written in sound. Jacob tilted his head in synchronization, nodding as though passing the rhythm into meaning. Then, without warning, he extended both arms outward, palms facing the void. His body stiffened. Isaiah's journal records, "I feared the bridge itself would take him, pull him into the gorge as it has taken others, but it did not. It gave him back." Jacob lowered his arms, turned and walked home, eyes glazed, face serene. Elizabeth's perspective that evening fills in what Isaiah could not see. In her journal she wrote, "Jay returned soaked, clothes clinging to his frame, but his skin was warm to the touch despite the weather. He looked at me for the first time in weeks, directly, as if recognition had returned, yet his words chilled me more than his silence. He said, 'It is almost ready. Soon we will cross together.' I dared not ask what he meant. That was the last sentence she ever recorded in her hand. The rest of the Mercer story comes from Isaiah and from county records, because Elizabeth's journal ends abruptly there. The days that followed spiraled with inevitability. Jacob no longer resisted food, but he consumed with mechanical efficiency, as though feeding the body for a purpose not his own. He spoke sparingly, always about the bridge. It waits. It listens. It is ready. Isaiah, increasingly desperate, appealed to the local sheriff, William Doherty. The sheriff, already wary of Sutton's crossing after years of whispered tales, agreed to accompany Isaiah one night to witness Jacob's nocturnal ritual. Their presence would etch itself into the official record, though in careful language, stripped of its terror. On January the 20th, the three men walked the frozen path together, Jacob at the lead, silent, Isaiah and the sheriff trailing cautiously, the moon reflected off ice-crusted branches, casting the valley in silver light. At the bridge's center, Jacob stopped, raised his arms again, and this time began tracing shapes in the air, triangles, spirals, patterns mimicking those he had scrawled at home. The sheriff admitted in his report that the sound of the river shifted as Jacob gestured, as though the roar rearranged itself into layered voices. He wrote, "Though I cannot give rational explanation, I perceived within the water's tumult the shape of syllables, near to language yet not of any tongue I know." The sheriff was a practical man, his reports usually curt. The fact that he put pen to such a statement speaks louder than the words themselves. Isaiah broke the trance with a shout. He rushed forward, seized Jacob's arm and pulled him back toward the road. The sheriff assisted, both men dragging Jacob from the bridge. But Jacob did not resist. His body went limp, eyes rolled upward, mouth slack. When they reached the Mercer homestead, he collapsed entirely. For hours he lay unresponsive, breathing shallowly, pulse steady but faint. Elizabeth wept, Isaiah prayed, and the sheriff left in silence. Unwilling to involve himself further, he filed only a minimal record, omitting the geometry, omitting the voices, yet his handwriting trembled on the page. What followed was worse. Jacob awoke before dawn. He did not speak. He did not eat. Instead, he walked into the barn and with a piece of coal filled the walls with patterns until no surface remained untouched. Isaiah described it as a cathedral of forms, as though the very structure had become an altar. When he tried to intervene, Jacob turned his head slowly and whispered, "It will open, soon." His voice was not his own. Elizabeth, already hollowed by weeks of dread, collapsed to her knees. Isaiah wrote that he had never seen such despair in another human face. By January's end, Sutton's Crossing was no longer a cursed place whispered about in town. It had become the center of a ritual, and Jacob Mercer, its chosen vessel, and those who witnessed it knew a truth they dared not spread. The bridge was not the site of accidents or disappearances. It was a threshold waiting for one who could hear clearly enough to open it. The first days of February 1901 brought no thaw, only a tightening of winter's grip. The Mercer household seemed frozen in its own season of dread, a house suspended between silence and the slow creep of inevitability. Jacob's state could no longer be called illness. He was not delirious nor incapacitated. He was active, but active in a direction that terrified those who loved him. His waking hours were consumed by the drawings, by long vigils staring east, and by the muttered cadence of sounds no one else could hear. Isaiah wrote, "Jay no longer belongs to time as we count it. He eats, sleeps, and rises in rhythms of another order. His days answer not the sun, but something older." The sheriff had washed his hands of the case. His official entry was skeletal, Mercer suffering nervous collapse, under watch of family. That was the county's last formal acknowledgement. Yet the townsfolk knew something was unraveling. Children dared each other to walk within sight of the Mercer farm, then sprinted away screaming that they'd seen Jacob's face at the window, pale as snow, watching them with eyes that did not blink. The churchgoers whispered that Elizabeth had stopped attending entirely, and in Irondale's general store, men dropped their voices when the subject of Sutton's Crossing arose, as if the bridge itself might overhear them. Inside the house, Elizabeth was deteriorating faster than her husband. No longer did she write in her journal. No longer did she argue with Isaiah about how to save Jacob. She moved like a ghost, performing tasks without will. Isaiah feared that the bridge's reach had extended into her mind as well. One night, he woke to find her standing barefoot in the snow, facing east, lips moving soundlessly. When he dragged her inside, she resisted with a strength he did not expect, hissing through clenched teeth. "He waits for me too." She had no memory of the episode at dawn. Jacob himself seemed to grow stronger even as his humanity receded. He carried timber to the barn with ease beyond his former capacity. He worked by moonlight, rearranging beams and stones, assembling a pattern within the structure itself. Isaiah described it as a geometry of space, not of paper, angles that create the sense of more room than the barn could hold. Visitors would not have understood. To an outsider it might look like random carpentry, but to Isaiah, who had studied Jacob's compulsive drawings, it was unmistakable. Jacob was building a physical form of the same patterns that haunted his sketches. The barn had become a chamber aligned with whatever the bridge transmitted. It was during these nights that Isaiah began hearing faint echoes himself. He wrote, "While tending the lantern I perceived the roar of the river, though we stood a mile distant. I fear the sound now resides within me. I stuffed my ears with wool, yet still it murmurs." His accounts grow shaky here, the pen marks erratic. Fear was no longer for Jacob alone. Isaiah realized he too was being tuned, however unwillingly. The most chilling account comes from February 8th. Isaiah entered the barn at midnight to find Jacob seated in the center of his geometric construction, cross-legged, eyes shut, palms open. Around him, the marks on the walls seemed to shimmer in the lantern light as though vibrating. Jacob opened his eyes, fixed them on his brother, and spoke a sentence Isaiah would never forget. "The bridge is not a place, it is a mouth. And when it opens, it will not close for us alone." Isaiah fled the barn in terror, leaving his brother seated in the glow of impossible shapes. Elizabeth, meanwhile, withdrew deeper into silence. She refused food. She refused warmth. She sat by the window staring toward the bridge as Jacob once had, her lips moving faintly in rhythm with the unseen cadence. Isaiah realized he was losing them both, not to illness, but to allegiance. Sutton's Crossing was no longer content with one devotee. It was consuming the family entire. The snowstorms of that February sealed the homestead off from most visitors. Only Isaiah's journals, brittle with age but furious in detail, preserve what happened. He begged for divine intervention, but the church offered none. He appealed to the mine foreman, but work excused absence in those isolated months. Alone, he faced the spectacle of his family being rewritten by the rhythm of the bridge. And still, each night, Jacob walked to the trestle. Isaiah dared not follow any longer. He admitted, "I fear what will happen if I hear too much. I fear I too will nod in agreement." His final lines from that month tremble with resignation. "It waits for us. It waits for all of us. Soon, Jay will not return. Soon, perhaps, none of us will." By the third week of February 1901, Sutton's Crossing had become not just a place of dread, but a locus of anticipation. Those who lived in the valley spoke of strange sounds carrying over the frozen hills at night, the river's roar punctuated by what seemed like chanting, though no words could be made out. Dogs howled and would not cross the eastern ridge. The sheriff admitted privately that he heard a voice inside the current when he patrolled near the gorge, but he swore Isaiah to silence and refused ever to return. Fear had become communal, though no one dared name its source aloud. At the Mercer homestead, dread had solidified into routine. Jacob left the house every evening after sundown and returned before dawn. Elizabeth no longer tried to restrain him. She seemed almost soothed by his absences, as though the house itself was relieved when he carried his influence elsewhere. But Isaiah noted that she began preparing food for him at odd hours, setting bread and water out at midnight as if awaiting the return of a traveler from another world. He wrote bitterly, "She feeds him like one feeds a priest returning from temple. She does not ask where he goes. She does not wish to know." One night, Isaiah dared to shadow him again. The moon was thin, the sky veiled in cloud, yet Jacob's figure moved confidently down the icy path. When he reached the bridge, Isaiah saw not only his brother, but others. 3 figures already stood upon the wooden span, waiting. Their outlines were indistinct in the mist, but their presence undeniable. Jacob joined them without hesitation, and together they raised their arms in unison. Isaiah froze, unable to move closer. He swore later that the sound of the river shifted, no longer chaotic but structured, like a chorus of voices weaving patterns. He fled before the ritual ended. When he confronted Elizabeth the next morning, desperate, she simply whispered, "It welcomes him. He is no longer alone." That sentence broke Isaiah more than any vision could. His sister-in-law had crossed an invisible threshold. She no longer fought the current. She floated in it. By February the 20th, the barn was transformed beyond recognition. Isaiah described it as a place unfit for livestock, yet fit for sacrifice. Jacob had stripped the loft, removed tools, and lined the floor with layered symbols in ash and chalk. The geometry of the walls seemed to lean inward, though no boards had shifted. Visitors would have seen only disorder, but Isaiah knew what it was. A chamber tuned to the bridge's rhythm, an echo chamber to magnify the current's whisper. Elizabeth was often found sitting inside, hands folded in her lap, humming softly in time with the unseen pulse. When Isaiah begged her to leave, she only shook her head. "It would follow us. You cannot unhear once you have heard." The resignation in her voice was final. Isaiah's desperation reached a climax on February 24th. He attempted to destroy the barn. Armed with kerosene, he doused the walls and struck a match. The fire took quickly, but died quicker. He swore the flames bent backward, collapsing into smoke without consuming the wood. The markings on the beams remained unscathed. Jacob found him on his knees in the snow, clutching the spent matchbox, muttering prayers. His brother placed a hand on his shoulder, not in anger, but in something close to pity, and whispered, "You cannot burn what is not yours. It has already claimed us." That night, Elizabeth vanished. She was last seen at the kitchen table, eyes distant, hands folded. By dawn, she was gone. Her boots remained by the door. The snow outside bore no footprints. Isaiah tore the valley searching, but found only the sound of the river, louder than ever, as if mocking him. Jacob offered no explanation. He said, "She heard the call more clearly than we." The town speculated that Elizabeth had taken her own life, hurling herself into the gorge as others had before. But Isaiah knew she had not jumped. There was no body, no trace. She had crossed, and the bridge had not returned her. Jacob did not mourn. His drawings intensified, his strength redoubled. He worked the barn until dawn, humming in cadence with the river. Isaiah wrote in despair, "I am the last who resists. Soon I will be alone, or else I too will nod. Either the bridge will take me, or I will join them willingly. The choice grows less mine each day." By month's end, the Mercer family had ceased to be a family. They had become an extension of Sutton's Crossing, and the bridge had claimed its first life openly. March of 1901 opened not with thaw, but with absence. Elizabeth was gone, and her silence settled heavier than snow upon the Mercer homestead. Isaiah wrote of her disappearance with blunt despair. "The house is hollow without her. I hear her hum in the walls, though she is not there. Perhaps she hums from the bridge, perhaps she hums from below it." That was the tone of his journals now, not inquiry but resignation. He no longer asked how she vanished, he asked only where she continued. Jacob's behavior changed after Elizabeth's departure. He no longer wandered like a somnambulist. He moved with purpose. Each night he departed for Sutton's Crossing, carrying with him objects Isaiah could not always identify, stones, lengths of timber, once even a mirror from Elizabeth's dresser. When questioned, he said only, "They will know what to do with it." Isaiah never learned who they were, the others on the bridge, the voices in the river, or something that used both. The barn was no longer a workshop. It had become a sanctum. On March 3rd, Isaiah ventured inside and found the floor arranged with objects taken from the house, chairs, a cradle, jars of preserves, even Elizabeth's shawl. They were arranged not randomly but in spirals, radiating outward from the center of the chamber. Jacob sat cross-legged among them, eyes closed, whispering in cadence with the current. Isaiah described the atmosphere as air thick as syrup, difficult to breathe, heavy with waiting. He fled before Jacob opened his eyes. But his terror grew worse the following night. He awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hall. Elizabeth's. Her tread was unmistakable, light and deliberate. He rose, heart pounding, and followed the sound into the parlor. The room was empty, yet the shawl was gone from the barn. The next morning, Jacob wore it draped over his shoulders like vestments. "She lends her warmth still," he said with a faint smile. Isaiah struck him in rage, but Jacob did not resist. He only whispered, "You will understand soon." By March 10th, Isaiah was no longer alone in his suspicion that something unnatural was occurring. Townsfolk began reporting odd phenomena. A miner swore he saw torches moving across the bridge at midnight, though no party had crossed. Children claimed to hear humming in the wells near Sutton Hollow. A farmer's cattle refused to cross the eastern pasture, bellowing and breaking fences to avoid the gorge. And always beneath these stories, the river roared louder than its thaw should allow, a sound that carried miles through the still air like a chant spread across the hills. Sheriff Doherty, pressured by townspeople, rode out once more on March 14th. His visit lasted less than an hour. Isaiah recorded that the sheriff entered the barn, stood silently for several minutes, and emerged pale, lips trembling. He offered no words, mounted his horse, and left without farewell. That was the last time he ever visited the Mercers. In his later records, he omitted the barn entirely. Whatever he saw, he chose not to preserve in ink. But Isaiah noted, he saw enough to fear the truth. He saw enough to abandon us. Isaiah's final act of resistance came on March 18th. He planned to lead Jacob away from the valley, forcibly if necessary. He saddled 2 horses, packed food, and confronted his brother at dawn. "We ride west," he demanded. Jacob regarded him calmly, then shook his head. "The bridge has no west." His words were not argument but fact, spoken with the calm certainty of scripture. When Isaiah tried to pull him outside, Jacob's body stiffened, immovable as stone. The attempt ended in futility. Isaiah collapsed in tears, and Jacob laid a hand upon his shoulder, murmuring, "It waits for you as well. You cannot leave what is beneath your feet." The journal entries falter after this point. Isaiah wrote less, scratched lines that read like confessions. "I hear it always now. The hum is in the boards, in the water bucket, in my pulse. Soon I will nod without knowing. Soon I will not resist." His words trail into near illegibility, scrawls that suggest the ink could not keep pace with the terror in his mind. By the final week of March, the Mercer farm stood like a shrine to absence. Elizabeth was gone. Jacob belonged to the bridge, and Isaiah, last of the household, was crumbling, haunted not only by what he saw, but by what he heard rising from the gorge, a call that did not end, did not sleep, did not allow refusal. The family's collapse was no longer approaching. It was already here. The only question left was how the bridge would claim the final brother, and whether it would keep him. April arrived, but spring did not. The snow retreated, yet the valley felt colder than ever. The thaw revealed bones of deer in the shallows, stripped bare by something swifter than rot. Isaiah noted that no carrion birds descended on the carcasses. Even vultures will not touch what the river claims, he wrote. The air hung thick with damp silence, a silence broken only by Jacob's nocturnal rituals. On April the 2nd, Isaiah spied from the window as Jacob carried bundles to the bridge. He watched him place the objects along the railing: jars of salt, tools from the mine, Elizabeth's Bible. Each he set down carefully with reverence before stepping back and bowing his head. Then came the chanting, a guttural sound not of words, but of vibrations. The bridge seemed to answer. Isaiah swore the timbers themselves shuddered beneath the pressure of a voice not heard but felt. He gripped the window frame until his knuckles bled. The next morning, when he confronted his brother, Jacob simply said, "They return what is offered. In time, they will give more than they take." The calmness of his tone unnerved Isaiah more than rage or delirium ever could. This was conviction, devotion. Jacob was no longer a victim. He was a disciple. The townsfolk began whispering. On April the 5th, a schoolteacher reported hearing bells tolling across the hollow in the dead of night, though the church steeple remained dark. 2 miners claimed they saw figures standing at the center of Sutton's crossing, tall and still, though when they approached, the bridge was empty. Livestock strayed toward the gorge and were later found drowned downstream, eyes clouded not with water, but with ash-colored film. Isaiah attempted to intervene one final time on April 9th. He followed Jacob to the bridge, intent on dragging him back by force, but what he witnessed arrested him in place. Jacob was not alone. A ring of figures, faceless, translucent, barely distinguishable from mist, encircled him at the center of the span. They did not move, yet the air pulsed with rhythm, as though every heartbeat in Isaiah's chest was synchronized to theirs. Jacob raised his arms, and the figures leaned closer without bending. Isaiah fled before they touched him, though he admitted in his journal that the greatest terror was not their presence, but the welcome he felt in their silence. From that night, Isaiah refused to sleep indoors. He camped in the orchard, clutching a lantern, convinced the house itself now whispered. The boards creaked with footsteps no one made, windows rattled though no wind stirred, and from the barn came the hum, the spirals Jacob had drawn vibrating faintly, glowing with condensation even in the dark. Isaiah's sanity frayed like old rope. His entries grew shorter, sharper. They do not ask, they command. The bridge feeds, and it grows. On April 15th, the town awoke to disaster. A hunting party of 4 men vanished after setting out toward the ridge. Only their hounds returned, muzzles bleeding, eyes wide, refusing to cross the big river. When the men's families approached Isaiah, begging for answers, he could only weep. He knew where they had gone. He knew who had taken them. That same night, he watched Jacob kneel in the barn amid the spiral of objects. The air shimmered, as if heated, though the chill outside bit hard. And then Isaiah saw it. The geometry shift, lines bending into impossible angles, shapes folding into themselves like doors turning inside out. For a heartbeat, the barn did not contain space. It contained elsewhere. Jacob's voice thundered, not as a man's, but as something amplified, speaking in unison with countless whispers. The gate widens. Isaiah collapsed, trembling, his mind clawing at comprehension but failing. He wrote in his final coherent entrance, "Try. The bridge is not a place, it is a mouth, and my brother has taught it to hunger." The following week, Isaiah vanished. His journal ended abruptly on April the 20th with a single unfinished line. "If you find these pages, know that what waits at Sutton's crossing is not bound to wood and water, it waits in us all." From then on, the Mercer farm stood abandoned. But the bridge remained, growing in legend, its appetite unchecked, its silence deeper than ever. What began as whispers in the current had become something worse, something fed by devotion, disappearance, and the steady surrender of human will. The Ozarks had birthed a gate, and the gate was open. By the summer of 1901, Sutton's Crossing was no longer just a local superstition. Whispers carried downriver with the driftwood and out through the hills into neighboring counties. Merchants in Farmington spoke of the Mercer homestead as a place hollowed by the devil. Miners in Potosi muttered prayers when carts rattled too close to the big river. Even in St. Louis, a reporter for the Post-Dispatch jotted notes about a haunted bridge in the Ozarks after overhearing tales from itinerant laborers. The story was moving, multiplying, feeding on attention. The gate was drawing eyes. But not all who heard recoiled. Curiosity has always been a lure stronger than fear. A group of young men, university students from St. Louis, decided to test the legend. They arrived in Washington County on July the 3rd, carrying lanterns, notebooks, and a photographer's bulky camera. Locals warned them to stay clear of Sutton's Crossing after dusk, but the students laughed. "It is only the wind," one insisted. That evening, they marched toward the bridge while the townsfolk barred their doors. Only one returned. His name was Charles Pennington, a medical student. He staggered into Irondale at dawn, shoes gone, clothes shredded by briars, eyes wide and staring. He spoke little, but what he managed froze the blood of his listeners. They stood behind us, though the planks were empty. They watched us, and then the river climbed. His companions were never found. The camera surfaced weeks later, washed downstream, its glass plates warped. Images blackened into swirls that resembled the very spirals Jacob Mercer had scrawled on his barn walls. Authorities could no longer ignore the bridge. On July the 20th, Sheriff Doherty summoned county officials and engineers from the Palmer mine. Their decision was swift. Sutton's Crossing must be destroyed. Men with axes and saws rode out to dismantle the trestle. The operation began under clear skies, but by midday, clouds rolled in with unnatural speed. Witnesses in town swore the air grew so heavy it pressed on the chest like stone. The workers did not last an hour. One collapsed without warning, clutching his skull as though it were splitting. Another dropped his axe and fled screaming into the woods, never to return. The foreman ordered the men back, but a chorus of whispers rose from the gorge, distinct as human speech, though no words could be discerned. Tools slipped from sweating hands. Eyes darted toward the water where shapes stirred beneath the surface, indistinct yet vast. The foreman ended the attempt. "Better to leave it to rot," he muttered, pale as death. The bridge was left standing. That night, the townsfolk reported the sound of hammering echoing from Sutton Hollow. Not human hammering, no metallic strike of tool on wood, but a dull, resonant thud, as if the bridge itself was repairing what little damage the men had done. Come dawn, no cut mark remained. The timbers were whole, stronger than before. The legend hardened into certainty. Sutton's Crossing could not be undone by human hands. It had passed beyond construction into consecration. It was no longer merely a span of timber and nails. It was kept. Meanwhile, Isaiah Mercer's disappearance was spoken of less as a tragedy and more as a warning. Some claimed he had been taken. Others whispered he had given himself willingly, drawn at last into the river's covenant. The truth lay locked in his unfinished journal, which passed quietly into the possession of a clergyman in Farmington. That clergyman, Father O'Rourke, began preaching fiery sermons about a gate unsealed in our midst. His warning split the community. Some parishioners clung to his words, while others mocked him as superstitious. But he kept Isaiah's journal close, reading from it privately, marking passages with trembling hands. By autumn of that year, Sutton's Crossing was not just a haunted place. It was a contested one, a battlefield between those who wished to seal it and those who sensed its pull but dared not admit it aloud. The bridge had grown beyond wood and stone. It was an idea, a curse that traveled faster than hoofbeats, further than rumor, and deeper than belief. And still, night after night, the voices rolled from the gorge, carrying with them the promise of a threshold not meant for men to cross, and yet not impossible. Father Michael O'Rourke was not a man easily shaken. He had buried children lost to diphtheria, counseled miners after cave-ins, and seen his parishioners driven mad by fever and poverty. Yet Isaiah Mercer's journal broke something in him. He read it by candlelight in the rectory, lips tightening with each page. The geometry described in charcoal, the whispers, the silence that seemed to breathe. By the final entry, O'Rourke no longer doubted. He believed Sutton's crossing was not merely cursed, it was a desecrated threshold, a tear in the veil between the human and the inhuman. On the first Sunday of September 1901, O'Rourke declared war. From his pulpit in Farmington, he thundered, "Brothers and sisters, a gate has been opened in Washington County. It calls to our children, our wives, our souls. If we do not seal it, it will claim us all." He read aloud passages from Isaiah's journal, his voice trembling not with fear but fury. He swore to lead a procession to Sutton's Crossing and sanctify it once and for all with the rites of Holy Church. Dozens volunteered, though most with trembling hands. On the appointed night, September the 9th, a caravan of wagons departed Farmington, bearing lanterns, hymnals, and a wooden crucifix taller than any man. O'Rourke himself carried a vial of consecrated oil and a battered Bible. He was determined to meet the bridge not with superstition, but with sacrament. They arrived at Sutton Hollow just after dusk. The gorge exhaled cold mist, though the air was warm. Frogs fell silent. Even the insects ceased. One woman later recalled, "It was as if the world leaned in to listen." The procession halted at the eastern approach. O'Rourke raised the crucifix, its shadow long against the planks, and commanded the people to sing. The hymn began strong, "A mighty fortress is our God," but faltered as the voices of the gorge rose to meet it. Not screed-echoes, not howls, a low harmony, uncanny in its precision, weaving through their song until their melody was drowned in alien cadence. Still, O'Rourke pressed forward. He stepped onto the bridge, sprinkling oil across the boards, murmuring Latin prayers with fierce conviction. The crowd followed, lanterns swinging, though their courage wavered. Midway across, the procession halted. The crucifix trembled in its stand. Not from wind, there was none, but from vibration, as though the planks themselves pulsed like flesh. Witnesses swore they saw figures rise in the mist below, not fully formed, yet human in outline. Dozens of them, drifting just beneath the water's surface, mouths moving in perfect unison with the sound in the gorge. Children cried, women clutched their rosaries, men gripped the railings, eyes wide with disbelief. O'Rourke planted himself at the center of the bridge and shouted above the din, "By the blood of Christ I command you, depart!" He drove the crucifix into a gap between the planks. The mist recoiled for a moment. The sound diminished, breaking into dissonance. For the first time, resistance seemed possible. The people cheered, voices raw with desperation. But triumph turned to horror in an instant. The crucifix splintered at its base with a crack like a rifle shot. The vibration surged back tenfold, rattling lanterns, buckling knees. One man was hurled against the railing, his lantern dropping into the river below. The mist swallowed the flame without smoke or steam. Then silence. Total. Absolute. Every throat stilled. Every footstep froze. The crucifix, shattered, was gone. Only the jagged stump remained, oil-stained and slick with condensation. O'Rourke staggered, clutching his Bible to his chest. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. He fell to his knees, eyes wide in terror not of defeat but of recognition. Witnesses swore he whispered only "Twinpan," words before collapsing unconscious. It listens. The procession fled, abandoning their tools of sanctity. They carried O'Rourke back to town, broken and silent. He never returned to his pulpit. For the rest of his days he spoke little, and when pressed, repeated only, "It listens, it learns." From that night forward, no priest, minister, or preacher dared approach Sutton's Crossing. Faith had met the bridge and faltered. The people drew their curtains tighter. The gorge was not just feared, it was obeyed. The gateway was no longer whispered of in shame or doubt. It was spoken of with the finality of law. Sutton's Crossing was no place for man or God. It belonged to something else entirely. The winter of 1902 was cruel. Ice bent the apple trees in the hollows, and the big river carried chunks of frozen stone downstream with a sound like breaking bones. Yet Sutton's Crossing did not freeze. Even as the tributaries iced over, the water beneath the bridge churned black and restless, steaming like a wound that refused to close. Locals took it as a sign. The gate had its own season, immune to nature's rhythms. By now, the bridge's reputation had crossed county lines. It was no longer a local curse, but a whispered challenge, a forbidden place where men might test their courage or their hunger. They began to come in secret. Not farmers or miners, but strangers, men with city accents, coats too fine for the Ozarks, books of symbols tucked under their arms. They were not pilgrims of faith, but seekers of something older, darker. The first were said to be students from Chicago, dabblers in theosophy and ritual magic. They arrived in February, lodging briefly in Irondale before slipping away into Sutton Hollow with candles and chalk. What they did on the bridge that night was never fully known, but the aftermath was unmistakable. Days later, townsfolk found symbols scrawled across the planks, circles within circles, lines bent into spirals, shapes that made the eyes ache if stared at too long. And near the railing lay 3 sets of boots, neatly arranged, though their owners were nowhere to be found. Word of their disappearance spread quickly, but it did not deter others. Instead, it lured more. By spring, the bridge had become a beacon for the discontent, the curious, the power-hungry. Men and women arrived under cover of night, some alone, some in groups, carrying candles, animals for sacrifice, even mirrors to catch the starlight. They treated Sutton's Crossing as a temple, an altar carved not by human hands, but by something beneath. The locals watched with dread. Some begged Sheriff Doherty to intervene, but he refused. "A man has a right to walk into his own damnation," he muttered. Others claimed Doherty himself had been changed since his last visit, that he spoke less, slept less, and sometimes wandered toward the hollow, as if listening to a call he could not resist. Fear made the town complicit. No one barred the seeker's path. No one warned them twice. In May, a letter arrived at the Farmington post office, addressed to no one in particular. It was written in a hand so cramped it nearly collapsed in on itself. The postmaster, unsettled, opened it. The message read simply, "We have crossed. The bridge is not wood but a tongue. We have gone where it speaks. You will follow." The letter was unsigned. Its ink smelled faintly of brine. Meanwhile, Isaiah Mercer's journal, kept hidden by Father O'Rourke, gained new significance. Certain passages described the spirals, the equations, the sense of geometry bending inward. A small circle of men in St. Louis, occultists calling themselves the Society of the Veil, obtained a copy of these pages. They became convinced that Sutton's Crossing was not merely a haunted place, but a threshold, a thin point between worlds. To them, it was not a curse, but an invitation. And so, on June 21st, the summer solstice, they came. 7 men in black coats carrying polished stones engraved with sigils. They sang in a language no one recognized as they walked across the planks. A farmer watching from the ridge swore the air grew heavy, pressing him to his knees. The men knelt at the bridge's center, arranging their stones into patterns echoing the ones Isaiah had drawn. The farmer fled before the ritual ended, but he told neighbors what he heard, a sound like 1,000 voices inhaling at once, followed by silence so complete it crushed the ears. The next morning the bridge was empty, the stones remained, glistening with condensation though the day was dry. The men were gone. Yet the farmer insisted that when he closed his eyes that night, he saw their faces, not screaming, not afraid, but exultant, mouths open in silent praise to something rising from the river. The Ozarks had feared Sutton's Crossing for decades, but now, for the first time, others sought it. The bridge was no longer only a curse, it had become a promise, an unholy altar for those willing to surrender everything for a glimpse of what lay beyond. By the autumn of 1902, the bridge no longer fed on wanderers alone. Its reach crept outward, threading through the hollows and ridges like roots seeking nourishment. What began as disappearances of the curious turned into vanishings among the unwilling. Entire families were touched. The Wilkes household was the first. In October, neighbors noted their cabin stood empty, door ajar, supper still cooling on the table. Chickens wandered loose in the yard, but the Wilkes family, husband, wife, and 3 children, were gone. A search party followed faint tracks into Sutton Hollow, stopping short at the bridge. There, pressed into the mud, were 5 sets of bare footprints, though the Wilkes had left their shoes by the cabin door. The prints ended at the planks, and beyond that, nothing, not even a scuff of wood. By November, it happened again. The Crowley brothers, trappers known for setting lines along the big river, failed to return. Their canoes drifted back downstream, nets still tied, poles still upright, but no men. Locals said they had heard a strange sound that night, not screams, not the voices, but a steady rhythmic thudding, as though the gorge itself had a heartbeat. The river walked, one miner muttered, refusing to explain further. The land itself began to betray signs of sickness. Trees closest to the gorge twisted unnaturally, their branches bending not toward the sun but downward, straining toward the water as if drawn by invisible weight. Deer carcasses turned up with their organs missing, but no wound to show entry. Dogs refused to hunt near Sutton Hollow, howling until their voices cracked if dragged within sight of the bridge. Farmers complained of milk souring overnight, bread molding before it cooled, and wells turning bitter. The Mercer orchard, long abandoned, became the clearest marker of change. Where once apples grew in neat rows, the trees now bloomed year-round, blossoms clinging even through frost. Yet no fruit formed, only petals that never fell, white and waxen like funeral shrouds. Some claimed to hear whispering in the orchard at night, though no wind stirred. Children dared one another to steal petals, but those who did found them gone by morning, dissolved into damp patches on their pillows, smelling faintly of the river. Sheriff Doherty, once determined to face down the bridge, grew gaunt and silent. He was seen more often near the hollow, standing at its edge as if waiting for something. When asked why he lingered, he replied only, "It has to be fed." Weeks later, he too disappeared. His badge was discovered nailed to the bridge railing, slick with condensation. The townsfolk grew desperate. Some fled outright, abandoning farms generations old. Others tried to bargain, leaving offerings at the bridge: bread, whiskey, slaughtered goats. Nothing changed. If anything, the offerings seemed to encourage it, for the disappearances only increased, and still the voices whispered, patient, inexorable. A strange fog began rolling through Sutton Hollow in December, dense and luminous, glowing faintly even without moonlight. Travelers caught within reported strange sensations: dizziness, loss of time, visions of shapes towering above the bridge. One man swore he saw his dead mother beckoning to him from the planks, though she had been buried in Potosi years earlier. He ran, screaming, and never set foot near the hollow again. The Society of the Vale returned quietly that winter, convinced the gate was strengthening. They camped by the river for 3 nights, chanting beneath the fog. On the 4th morning, locals found only their campsite, tents collapsed, fires cold, stones arranged in spirals across the ground. No bodies, no signs of struggle, only silence. By the year's end, Sutton's Crossing was no longer whispered of as cursed. It was spoken of as alive. It had wants, patterns, an appetite that swelled in proportion to what it consumed. What began as whispers in water had spread to the land, to the air, to the very rhythm of life in Washington County. The bridge was not merely a mouth, it was a hunger that had learned to walk. In the spring of 1903, the state finally took notice. Reports of vanishings, families, lawmen, even entire groups, could no longer be dismissed as rumor. The Missouri Pacific Railroad sent surveyors to chart a possible spur through the county, and with them came state officials tasked with assessing Sutton's Crossing. They spoke of demolition, of rerouting trade, of ending once and for all the superstition choking progress. On April the 12th, 3 engineers and 2 deputies rode into the hollow. They carried drafting tools, dynamite charges, and rifles. The townsfolk did not follow. By dusk, smoke rose briefly above the gorge, detonations followed by silence. At midnight, the men had not returned. By dawn, only the horses reappeared, saddles slick with condensation, eyes rolling wild. Curious, a group of miners crept down the next day. They found the charges arranged neatly along the trestle, wires coiled as if awaiting ignition, but no men, no rifles, no tools. More disturbing still, the bridge bore no mark of tampering. Its timbers stood unscarred, freshly damp as though washed clean by unseen hands. The state issued no further expeditions. The Missouri Pacific abandoned its plans. One official, questioned years later, admitted, "The men who went there weren't lost, they were claimed, and we weren't about to offer more." From then on, Sutton's Crossing ceased to be approached with authority. Reason, law, industry, all had proven impotent. The bridge remained untouched, unbroken, growing only in silence and in legend. By 1905, the circle of those who remembered the Mercer family had grown thin. Old neighbors spoke less and less, as though the very act of recalling the family's fate carried danger. The children of Irondale whispered of Elizabeth wandering into the snow, calling a name no one could quite recall. Some said Isaiah was seen years later, gaunt and silent, carving strange symbols into fence posts before vanishing for good. But the details never aligned. Memory itself had become slippery, unstable. Those who had once spoken confidently of dates and times now stumbled over their own recollections. One miner swore Jacob Mercer had worked beside him weeks after the man was meant to be gone. A midwife insisted she had treated Elizabeth for an illness 2 years beyond her supposed disappearance. These weren't lies. They were fractures, fragments of reality bending under some unseen weight. Local pastors began to warn their congregations, "Do not utter the names of the bridge's dead. Do not dwell on them. Each remembrance is an invitation." Their sermons became heavy with avoidance, silence replacing scripture. When pressed, they offered no theology, only fear. What makes this more unsettling is the permanence of the bridge's image. Ask anyone from the Ozarks in that era and they will tell you they can forget faces, lose track of neighbors, but they cannot forget Sutton's crossing, the way it loomed black against the sky, the way the air thickened in its presence, the way their minds clouded afterward. It is as though the bridge was not a place but an anchor, something fixing itself in memory by erasing everything around it. The Irondale Register ran a single column on the Mercer family in early January 1901. It was short, oddly vague. Local foreman falls ill, family relocates. No mention of Jacob's silence, Isaiah's journals, or Elizabeth's frantic writings. By the following week, the column itself had vanished from archives, the issue reprinted with different text. Other papers tried. The Farmington Times reportedly drafted a long expose in 1902, citing interviews with neighbors who spoke of strange lights over the gorge and the Mercers' escalating madness. The editor, Charles Winthrop, received a personal visit from 2 county officials. Hours later, the story was pulled. Winthrop resigned within the month. His private notes, recovered decades later, contain only one line beneath the date of his resignation: "They do not want the bridge remembered." Even the St. Louis Post-Dispatch touched the matter briefly. Their article on rural superstitions of the Ozarks included a paragraph on Sutton's crossing, describing rumors of vanishing families. Within days, the paper issued a correction, stating the detail had been in error. The silence was not passive, it was enforced. Archives show blacked-out ledgers, missing police reports, erased census records, a whole family, Jacob, Elizabeth, Isaiah, reduced to whispers and contradictions. It raises the darkest possibility. Not only did the bridge consume the Mercers, it consumed the truth about them. And the institutions we trust to preserve memory became its accomplices. By 1907, Sutton's crossing was no longer just a local curse. Word of the gateway to hell had traveled beyond Missouri's hollows, whispered in St. Louis taverns, printed in obscure pamphlets, even carried into Chicago by drifters and miners who fled the county. What locals feared, outsiders coveted. Occultists arrived first, quiet men in long coats carrying satchels filled with compasses, divining rods and notebooks marked with sigils. They camped at the edge of the gorge, sketching the bridge by moonlight, measuring its shadows, tracing the geometry of its supports as if they contained hidden codes. Locals swore they never returned to town by day. Their campfires burned for weeks, then vanished. No bodies were found, only a circle of stones blackened as though by unnatural flame. Then came the seekers, men who craved spectacle. Young thrill hunters rode in from Kansas City, wagering bottles of whiskey on who could cross at midnight and emerge laughing. Some did return, pale and trembling, never speaking again of what they had seen. Others simply never came back. Their horses reappeared days later, reins frayed, eyes wild, as if they had been driven through hell itself. By 1910, the bridge had become both pilgrimage and grave. Its silence fed the daring, its reputation fed the lost. And with each outsider drawn in, the legend deepened, as though Sutton's Crossing had grown hungry for fresh blood, not bound by Irondale's fear, but by something older, patient and unspeakable. What bound these outsiders to the Mercer legacy was not chance. In 1911, a farmer found scraps of parchment near the gorge, likely left by one of the occult camps. The drawings were almost identical to the markings Isaiah once described Jacob carving into the barn. Interlocking triangles, spirals collapsing inward, symbols that seemed to pulse when stared at too long. Historians comparing the fragments to Elizabeth's recovered journals found the same geometry scrawled in margins, as if Jacob's silence had been replaced by a language of shapes. Strangest of all, similar diagrams surfaced in St. Louis within the personal notebooks of a physician who had briefly treated bridge victims. How had Mercer's private madness traveled so far, copied by men who never knew him? It suggested something more insidious, that the bridge itself carried memory like a contagion, transmitting Mercer's descent to those who lingered too close. Knowledge was not learned at Sutton's Crossing. It was implanted. The symbols did not fade. They spread, mutating, resurfacing across counties and decades, the same handless script etched into barns, fences, and cave walls, always triangles, always converging inward, as though pointing towards something buried in the heart of the gorge. By the mid-1910s, the symbols were no longer confined to hushed journals or forgotten scraps. They began appearing carved into pews of the Irondale Methodist Church, scratched onto hymnals, even burned into doorframes. Congregations recoiled, believing the devil himself had marked their sanctuaries. Pastors thundered from pulpits, declaring the patterns gateways for demons. Some churches closed altogether, unable to scrub away what kept reappearing. But while churches tried to erase them, others worked to preserve them. In Farmington, an obscure lodge calling itself the Circle of the Triad began meeting in secret. Their members were prominent men, judges, bankers, even a county official, yet their minutes, leaked decades later, describe rituals performed with Mercer's diagrams at their center. They believed the symbols were not curses, but instructions, a map to hidden power lying beneath the river. The conflict split the community. Farmers carried charms to ward off the markings, while miners whispered that their supervisors had joined the circle. Every faction agreed on one point: Sutton's Crossing was no ordinary bridge. It had become a battlefield of belief, where faith, fear, and ambition collided. And beneath it all, the gorge waited, patient, feeding on both prayer and secrecy alike.